Hello and welcome to Resilience, the global adaptation podcast, the show where we'll be exploring the best solutions and cutting-edge technologies for adapting to climate change.
From climate resilient forests to the use of artificial intelligence to the power of storytelling, we're coming to you from the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm Liz Bernhardt.
And I'm Marcus Neild. In our podcast, we'll be talking to the world's greatest adaptation experts, but we'll also be travelling around the world to meet people on the front lines of climate change to hear personal stories of how they've built resilience in their own community.
We're really excited to share some incredible climate success stories with you. Join us as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
So, here we are. The first episode of the long-awaited new series. How are you feeling about it, Liz?
I'm really excited. It feels like coming back to something that's both really familiar but also really new, because we've changed. The world has changed in the past 3 years. But the topic that we're working on, I think, has only gained in importance and relevance during that time. So the idea of people being resilient and nature being resilient and our societies and our buildings, I think that's more important than ever. What about you, Marcus?
Well, I think we had unfinished business, really, didn't we? So we had our pilot series, and by the end of that series, we ended up with a really engaged audience. And so since then, we've had so many requests. Can you cover this topic? When are you doing the next season? Can you interview this person or that person? So I'm really glad we can finally give our listeners what they want with more content. And I think it goes without saying, just like you said, topic of adaptation and resilience has grown enormously since our pilot series.
I actually Googled the term climate resilience recently, and it looks like interest in the topic has quadrupled over the past 5 years. That's crazy. I really think that we're doing this at a perfect time, and that we were maybe even ahead of the curve. But without further ado, let's move on to our topic of the day.
Yes, so today we are kicking off the series by looking at the role of buildings and architecture in adapting to climate change, which I think generally speaking is a topic that is underestimated in terms of its importance.
Should we start off with a couple of stats?
Let's do it.
So there are two figures in particular that I think really set the scene for the conversation that we're going to have today. First of all, for every dollar that you invest in climate resilient infrastructure, you get $4 of total benefits in return, mostly by avoiding damage to property.
Very nice. Okay, so clearly worth investing.
Right. And secondly, did you know that 40% of the buildings that we'll have in 2050 haven't even been built yet?
Okay, wow. So that's definitely an interesting opportunity.
Right. So if we could ensure that the 40% of buildings that are yet to be built are constructed with climate resilience in mind, then the amount of loss and damage we can avert is extraordinary. So basically, it's a huge opportunity to build almost half of our buildings better.
Very nice. Okay, so just before we introduce our first guest, I just want to flag that if listeners do want to know more about the practical side of all of this, then there's a great resource that UNEP put out called A Practical Guide to Climate Resilient Buildings and Communities. Whether you are facing extreme heat waves, floods, or storms, the practical guide shows you really clear, direct ways of how our buildings can be designed to face these threats. Now, with that said, let's introduce our first guest. Mariam Issoufou is an award-winning architect from Niger in West Africa. She tells us what it was like growing up in extreme heat and how that informed her love for architecture. We also talk about a museum exhibition that Mariam put together that uses augmented reality to visualize the impacts of climate change on buildings and the possible solutions.
Mariam, you grew up in Niger. I can imagine you must have really seen climate change impacting your community. Can you tell us a bit about it?
I grew up, when I was small, we lived in the capital in Niamey, which is sort of around the southern end of the country, so a bit more humid, and then spent the rest of my childhood actually in the middle of the Sahara Desert in a small town. And it was incredible to see how when I was living in the capital before we moved to the desert, it felt quite tropical. I have these memories of neighborhoods being very lush and green. And then when we came back from the capital, I was 12. And I mean, we came back from the desert rather. That had not only stopped, but we had already started having sandstorms in the capital, which used to be tropical. So in the span of 7 years, the desert had advanced so much that every time it rained, it would be preceded by a sandstorm. And the first time it happened, there was complete panic, literally, because some people had never seen that before. But I think now, moving 40 years almost or 30 years later, it has become much more dramatic than that. So there's also been sort of this evolution of going from the desert advancing to then having sort of these unpredictable weathers happening, so profound droughts, but then followed by floods. And very quickly, about maybe 15 years ago, 15 years ago, already starting to witness climate refugees coming into the city centers.
I can imagine that really has impacted your career, your choices in life in a lot of ways, including as an architect. How would you say those things have kind of fit together?
I think they fit together in sort of this weird asymmetrical ways to some extent, one thing kind of layering itself on top of the other. My first desire or sort of understanding of the power of architecture came from growing up in the desert and experiencing really extreme temperature. What that did for me and to me as an architect is that it made me hypersensitive to issues of temperature, to thermal comfort. So I very vividly remember coming home from school and sort of the entrance of our house was made out of earth. And I still remember to this day, every time I arrived there, the temperature would drop so dramatically compared to sort of out there in the sun as I was walking home from school that I would shiver. And I always remember that shiver because I think that it was easily a 10-degree temperature difference that would happen immediately. And this was not necessarily a fully enclosed space. It was just a covered space that was made out of earth. But then it really drove home to me how important our choices are as designers, as architects, as people in the construction environment. The fact that we rely on technology to sort of mask our problems is a profound issue, and it's a profound issue that has made it that as a field we contribute 40% to the world's pollution. And so I'm very preoccupied with these different aspects of my field and my responsibility, what I see as my responsibility as a practitioner, as an architect.
So, Mariam, now that you are a sort of award-winning, globally recognized architect, have you now been able to go back to your community and apply those skills?
Well, it's funny because the main reason I became an architect was to do that kind of work where I'm from. And so when I received my degree, immediately I set out to land a project, back home and set my firm in Niger. And to this day, my firm, 10 years later, is still headquartered in Niger.
Let's talk about some examples. So, what are some architecture projects that you've worked on that have been really successful in building climate resilience for communities and helping people adapt to climate change on the ground?
Every project we've worked on has had this attitude. So every project uses local materials. Every project was very much concerned with the economic cost and weight of architecture. So, to give an example, the very first project we ever worked on was a housing project in the city of Niamey, where we were thinking about, of course, the materials, the ecological aspect, but we were very much pondering on density and what does it mean, to be sort of this growing, especially on the continent being sort of one of the fastest growing parts of the world and the cities of the continent being some of the fastest growing on the planet. We saw sort of this incredibly important task at thinking through what density means and how do we actually produce density without having to create apartment buildings and skyscrapers and all of those things. And I think that worked quite successfully.
Mariam, I love that you talk about how the work that you do really helps to address a lot of modern issues, especially on this continent. You mentioned a few of specific climate change impacts that have influenced the way you think and the way you are working, things like extreme heat or sand and dust storms. How has your architecture helped to combat some of those hazards and other hazards of climate change?
What we aim to do is actually work that can represent examples of how we could practice architecture, or that maybe we should practice architecture in general. All of those projects are important proofs of concept to demonstrate that we do not have to compromise, actually, that making climate responsible. When we use earth, for example, to build a project, that soil comes from maybe 5 kilometers away from our site. So that means that by making that choice, not only is the material we're using better for the environment, but we also don't add pollution through the transportation, importation of different materials. So we make an impact from that point of view.
So Mariam, my co-host and friend Marcus, he lives a lot closer to London than I do. But we were really excited to learn about your recent exhibition in London at the Design Museum, which was called Adapt, Architecture and Climate Change. And that sounds like it's right up our alley. What was it about and what made it so special?
I mean, it was an exhibition of a different kind in that it lived on an app. And it was these filters that we designed to get people who would be in London, or and sort of in Europe in general, to see the world more the way we see it on our side of the planet, where the climate catastrophe is already here. We are already in the middle of it. And so we created these filters where you would see the design museum itself completely transformed by different climate catastrophes as though they were already there. So if essentially, London became a desert because, all the rains have dried out, which is impossible to think of, for London, obviously, or fires, So we had these series of filters to encourage viewers to really project themselves on their home turf inside of their own environment and to take a moment to imagine and to really understand that maybe 100 years from now, one of these scenarios could be happening in London. The way in which we transformed the design museum is that we applied this sort of extreme weather to it and to its sort of surrounding gardens, but also we transformed the design of the museum itself to see how the museum would survive, what it would need to do in order to weather that kind of weather event.
How do we get more people to do this kind of work when they're building buildings? How can we get like this to be taken up even more?
I would love to say that we have to advocate and make sure that more people hear about these different approaches. But one thing I learned is that we need to also think very carefully and very seriously about the economic aspects. What I found was that when I'm talking with a client, what is more likely to move them to want to apply some of these principles in their project is the economic impact. And in the case of what we're proposing, we're always proposing a cheaper solution. And that tends to speak much more loudly than any environmental impact you can talk about. And I believe that also makes sense.
Looking to the future, what are going to be the huge changes in climate resilient architecture in terms of our buildings and our homes?
This is a very difficult question because there is what I think is likely to happen versus what I hope will happen. From what I can see, the discussion about climate and architecture is very much focused still on technology as solution, on different sort of metrics. We have all these different checkboxes that are put in place, but that you can actually sidestep. There are just so many different loopholes. And that is still very much ongoing. I admit that concerns me because what I hope would happen is that we realize sooner rather than later that the answers are already with us. The answers are not necessarily something that needs to come out of a factory. The answers are not necessarily something that needs to be a technology, a technological gadget. We have known how to build based on climate our entire human existence. It is only in the 20th century that we chose to forget it. The intelligence and the wisdom is already embedded in a lot of the architecture that we had before. And I just hope that over the coming years, we actually start realizing this, start realizing that a lot of the lessons have already been acquired actually and learned, and figure out ways to apply them while very much living in this 21st century that has brought us also amazing advances, and progress.
That's great, Mariam. Thank you so much. And we do have just one very, very last question for you, and that is where can people find out more about your work?
We have a wonderful website where we showcase a lot of the work we're currently doing. And there's also a lot of the research we work on that has to do both with sustainability and all of these different complex layers that I talk about. This is something that I explore both through the work, but also through teaching and research. And so there's also a link towards our website at ETH Zurich, where we do a lot of this work as well. And it has many other layers we look into that, in my sense, all impact climate to some degree for different reasons.
Thanks so much, Mariam. So nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, very good. So, just to say that if you're interested in what Mariam was saying about the power of traditional knowledge and indigenous practices, then we'll also be looking at this topic in another upcoming episode that looks at how indigenous peoples are protecting themselves from the impacts of climate change by restoring ecosystems and nature. You'll also find a link to Mariam's website in the show notes.
That was great. I really enjoyed hearing about Mariam's personal story and how that's influenced her amazing career. So let's look at some examples on the ground with another very special guest, this time going over to the Caribbean. We're talking with Diann Black-Layne, who was the climate change ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda for 16 years, and now is their director of the environment. We wanted to speak with Diann about a pioneering new scheme in her country for climate-resilient homes.
Yeah, so I actually had the chance to visit this project last year, and it really opened my eyes to a totally different way of doing adaptation. So the government of Antigua and Barbuda and the UN Environment Programme essentially put together a Revolving Loans programme. And it allows residents to obtain low-interest loans to protect their homes from hurricanes, whether that's through acquiring hurricane shutters, reinforcing the roofs, or whatever it may be. We wanted to ask Diann about the impact that this scheme had on the community. Hello, Diann. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming. So in this show, we like to focus on solutions, but we also need to be realistic and clear-eyed about the crisis that we're facing. So could we start by asking you about something that's actually quite difficult in your country's history, which is Hurricane Irma in 2017. What was it actually like to experience a hurricane like that?
Yeah, so as you know, Antigua and Barbuda is such a tiny little island that whenever a hurricane hits, it's not like the United States. So my sister lives in the US, and whenever we see hurricanes heading to Miami and everybody gets into their car and drive away, we're like, oh my gosh, I wish we could do that too. A hurricane is really like having a tornado hitting for hours and hours and hours. And so it really is physically, mentally, emotionally draining. And you know that even if your home is safe-ish, your friends may not be, your family will not be. So no matter what your outcome would be, you will suffer significantly. So it takes hurricanes like Irma to bring attention of the world to what it is that we really need to do. So in one sense, as I went to COP that year, we saw an opening, an eye opening. We also saw opening for like the funds that we create. Smaller and developing states don't get that much access to the funds. So I felt this weight, I guess, to use that as leverage to communicate. So as the hurricane was happening, and I'm going to tell you my experience going through it, part of me as a negotiator saying that, listen, we have to go back and said, listen, this thing is going to happen not only to us, but it's going to happen to everybody else. So I guess in one way, as we we're going through that storm, I was thinking in a moment of literally terror like that, you try to think, your mind try to help you cope by saying, okay, what could be a good benefit coming out of this? So just pay attention, right? So that you can use it as part of your negotiation. So I'm a mother of 3 children. At the time, my kids were really young, and my daughter is special needs. In a hurricane situation like us, it is where you get hurt is when you try to leave the house. So even if the structure you're in is destroyed, just stay put. So you have to teach your children that, the young kids. And we said, if we ever get separated, let's pick a closet. You're getting them ready. And that was awful. I must say, I felt angry having to do that. That was the first time my children experienced a really big hurricane. They were like no more than 12. I mean, I experienced my first big hurricane when I was in my 20s, and then the next one in my 40s. And now they're already experiencing this, and they've experienced several since then. And that emotion and what I felt going through, I just felt I have to take that and write it down and incorporate it into our project designs and so on. Because that was the only thing I could think of at the time that would just keep me sane. I'm still suffering from, I mean, just talking about it, I get goosebumps.
I honestly can't even imagine for you to have that overview of keeping your family safe, but also thinking about the bigger picture.
We're accustomed to hurricanes, but category 1 is fine. Category 2, it's exciting. Category 3, they're kind of like, you're going to expect a bit of a hit. But that was something else differently. That was really different.
Listening to you speak there, Diann, it really makes me think of just how much money it's going to cost to adapt to these impacts. And it reminds me of an analysis that we did on this recently at UNEP. So this is our Adaptation Gap report from last year. And it showed that the annual cost of adapting to climate change in the region is around 2.4% of GDP, which is a huge amount. But when you consider that storm damages, like the kinds you've just explained, cost around 17% of GDP every year for Caribbean countries, we can see that although adaptation seems expensive, you're actually saving huge amounts over the long term. So my question for you, Diann, is, considering that Antigua and Barbuda produces, 0.002% of global greenhouse gas emissions, how do you think the international community could and should come together to address this crisis?
In my view, let's say if I was the queen of the world and we have the islands, coming and have to go to the COP, the amount of money we spent in international multilateral fund already, we could have fixed all the islands and done. We would never need to come to another COP. I mean, we are so small. But as I get more and more into project implementation and doing the work on the ground, I think globally there's a capacity problem to think creatively. There's a capacity issue with respect to how do we design, when we go to Wall Street and we go to all of these people who manage most of our money, they're not the people who can design projects.
We often talk about SIDS, the small island developing states, as really being very vulnerable. They're very unique in the sense that they're low-lying, right? They've got limited space and they've got limited resources. But I think it's really important to also understand, most importantly, that it's in those communities, and I think coming from communities like yours where we're going to see solutions coming out as well. And so I'd really love to hear some examples from you. What are some of the things that are happening that you're seeing in your country?
Okay, so if you look back in our development past, yours and mine and many other countries, most of the problems we had was solved at the local level. So in the case of something very simple like, so you live on an island and many people don't realize it until you actually live on the island. So if you're in, all islanders are jealous of everybody that lives in the States for one thing and one thing only. You order something from Amazon and it arrives in 2 days. And you can send it back if you don't like it. But can you imagine that is the same that you would have when you're ordering materials for your home? Windows, doors. But it's going to cost us 3-4 times as much.
This is a perfect segue to what we wanted to talk to you about, Diann, which is, so obviously UNEP and the Department of Environment are working together on this revolving loan program to help the community make their houses hurricane proof or more resilient to hurricanes. So we would love for you to tell us about that initiative.
Right. So the revolving loans scheme basically is designed to step out of the mainstream financial management system. We study everything, we check everything to see what would be the best intervention here. So the loans, you have to have an existing home, and the loans are to help you make the house more resilient. That occurred during the COVID period, when it means that the price of everything, shipping, everything went up by over 200%. So we're now looking at phase two of that, and to see how is it that we can mitigate that cost increase for materials. And so we're going using a bulk purchasing approach. And we did our first bulk purchasing for shutter material. And what we did was did a lot of research on new material that women can use. So we went out and we looked at shutters that was recommended for Miami, Florida, and Texas, but a lot of people there don't use them. And to encourage people to use them, they actually make them in different colors. So we got them in color, and we had 3,010 families who applied, which represent about 5% of homes in the country. And then now you would lend them the money to purchase the items, but because you're bringing it in bulk, it costs 80% less.
What other things do people use? Actually, how do you make your house more hurricane proof?
Some people redo the entire roof. The roof. You have shutters. You change the windows. You change your doors. And solar panel system, solar and with battery systems, that was very popular. And that's growing in popularity. And water storage.
So my understanding is that what makes this loan different and what makes it more of a kind of community-based loan is that the interest rates are very low for the recipients. And I read that another great thing about it was that the recipient gets a really long time to pay back the loan as well. And the thing I love about this scheme is the idea that when you pay back your loan, it means the next person can now make their house more resilient. So it has this kind of community incentive where by making yourself more resilient and paying it back, the community as a whole kind of perpetuates this resilience. So that's really, really interesting. Considering the really strong results that you've seen with the revolving loan program in Antigua, do you think that this is an initiative that other Caribbean countries could copy, and can it be scaled up?
We're doing the same thing in Grenada and in Dominica. It's very popular. I think it's a necessity. You gotta help people to do this, because already the people are in bank for mortgage already. They're already maxed out their lending capacity.
Diann,
So,
can I just ask, what's the average amount of a loan?
So we maxed out at 75,000 US dollars. The average was about maybe 35,000 US. But resilience is also financial resilience. I mean, you can't let them borrow every single cent that they have.
I think it's super inspirational. And Diann, you touched on so many points in terms of what it means to be resilient. What does resilience mean? You talk about psychological resilience, you talk about financial resilience, and we talk, of course, about climate resilience. But all these things are connected to each other. It sounds like in your country, and just judging by talking to you, you've got a lot of resilience. I can see that the people in Antigua and Barbuda are very resilient. Does that resilience give you hope for the future?
I remember in Dominica, they got hit by Maria 2 weeks after Irma, and 25% of their population left the island. Antigua got hit by Irma and Luis and so on, and we all stayed here. We all stayed here. So this is our home, and we know what we need to do to become resilient. We have that knowledge. And Antiguans are laser focused of getting it done, because we don't want this to be what we're defined by. We don't want to be made vulnerable, and we refuse to accept that as an inevitable. And this is why I go to the meetings. This is why I leave my kids. We know it can be done, and we're going to get it done, no matter what. And we cannot wait to the point where a hurricane can come and we're doing what it is we want to do, right? The hurricane pass and your kids are safe and they can go to school. And we believe that that can happen.
Diann, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you, really refreshing and inspirational for me, and very eye-opening just to hear your experiences. I really want to thank you for the conversation, for also telling us so much of your personal story and experience. And I love seeing the personal face of some of the negotiators that are in the processes that we support. When I hear stories like yours, it just really brings it to home.
Very good. Okay, so it was really nice catching up with that project again. And also a big shout out to the donors, which was a combination this time between Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, and the Adaptation Fund. So, final thoughts. Well, I guess we've covered augmented reality, extreme heat in Africa, the value of traditional knowledge, hurricanes, revolving loans that help people make their homes climate resilient. What else?
So one thing I thought was really cool that Diann touched upon was the fact that this is a great case of where you can look at both the causes and the impacts of climate change, because the construction industry itself is such a major emitter of greenhouse gases. Before we wrap up, I think it's really important to talk about something called the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, especially for those who want to get more involved in this topic. The Global ABC, as it's known for short, is the leading global platform for the building sector to commit to a common vision of zero emission and climate resilient buildings.
Yes, so the Global ABC does a number of things to achieve this vision. They published the Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction, which is a very comprehensive annual report. They were also the ones behind the Buildings Breakthrough, where many countries around the world pledged commitments to climate resilient and net zero buildings.
And last but certainly not least, since this is particularly relevant for our podcast, the Global ABC hosts its own adaptation hub, which brings stakeholders together from both public and private sectors to focus on adaptation strategies in the industry.
Excellent. So, I guess that's it from us. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much, everyone. Join us next time as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time. Richard Myron is the producer, and this has been an Earshot Strategies production.